yeah, back to perfectionism. At its best, it doesn't help us. Doesn't help us to be excellent. Doesn't help us to be really good. At its worst, it can be quite serious, actually, because there isn't really any such thing as perfectionism. Perfectionism is a human construct that doesn't really exist. And when you and a good example of that is you find that if you've written a really, really good document and you've worked so hard on it and you think that it's absolutely perfect, you'll find that you'll come back to it in 6 months' time and you'll look back on it and you'll think, actually, that's not so good. So, the standards change in our minds all the time. So the pursuit of perfectionism is very dangerous. As we said earlier, the pursuit of being better than others is also very, very dangerous. So I just want us to think a little bit about perfectionism and about the way we are. And I want just to do an exercise which is going to maybe challenge your thinking about what you think you have to be perfect in, and maybe help you to change some of what you do. So I'm going to share my screen again with you. And this is the exercise that I'm going to show you is an exercise known as Moscow. So this is an exercise known as Moscow. And what this exercise tells us is that usually, well, it's based on the principle that usually good enough is good enough. Usually. Sometimes we have to do better than good enough, but most often in the workplace, good enough is good enough. I mean, just a very quick anecdote about myself here. As I say, this is a subject that I've really struggled with over the years. And several years ago, I was working in Germany with a major corporate client, and I noted that, and I mean, I worked, I was away in Germany. I worked all hours of the day and most of the hours of the night. I was in a hotel and I was working on doing some work for this very, very large global organization. And my contact was the European Learning and Development lead, who happened to be British. And I got to know him really, really well. And we were chatting one day, and I said to him, I hope you don't mind me saying, Robert, his name was Robert, hope you don't mind me saying, but when you send me emails, those emails are very poorly punctuated and very poorly put together. I hope you don't mind me saying, I know him very well at this stage. We were I was saying it in a partly jokey way, saying that, his emails to me were, very, very short and sweet. And he obviously hadn't spent any time on them at all. And he said to me, he said to me this, because I was really surprised, I have to say. And he said to me, does it affect you? And I said, no, it doesn't affect me at all. He said, do you understand what I'm trying to say in the emails? And I said, yeah, I do. I'm just a little bit surprised, because I know that you don't normally write in that way. And he said, well, no, that's true, but I know that you don't mind. And so, I do emails to you very, 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 very quickly. And it was really challenging this, because I spent ages writing him emails. I spent ages. And he said, so I said, what makes you do that? And he said, well, here's the difference. The difference between me and you is this. It's now 3 o'clock. We are in Koblenz in Germany, which is just on the Rhine-Moselle sort of intersection. It's a beautiful part of the world. And he said, here's the difference. I'm going home in half an hour. I've been here since 6:30. I'm going home in half an hour. I'm going to be walking along the Rhine, and you're welcome to come with me if you want. We're going to be walking along the Rhine or the Moselle and relaxing. Whereas you, on the other hand, I suspect won't come. You, on the other hand, I suspect will go back to your hotel, and we were working on things, some of which don't really matter that much. And he was right. He was absolutely right. Firstly, I thought, let me stick to my standards. And then after that, it really challenged me, and I thought, you're right. You're right. Maybe I should be more like him. And so, in any case, this exercise just helps us to really challenge ourselves around perfection. So Moscow is an acronym. I'll go back to that screen, actually. Moscow is an acronym that stands for must have, should have, could have, and won't have. So must have, should have, could have, and won't have. And what it does is it challenges you to think about those categories for all of the pieces of work that you're doing. So whether that's a project or whether that's simply your day-to-day work, it encourages you to think about this and to discuss this with stakeholders if possible. So must have. And I'm going to run through this, and then I'm going to ask you just to simply do this for something that you're working on, whether it be a project or whether it be some day-to-day work that you're currently doing. So the first category is must have, which is a requirement which must be satisfied for your work to have the required impact on the stakeholders. The term here is impact. So what is it that has to be in place, has to be done brilliantly in order for your work to have the required impact on the stakeholders? What has to be done brilliantly in order for your work to have the required impact on stakeholders? The next category is should have, which is a priority, a work priority, a part of an aspect of your work which should be done really well if time and resources are available, but it isn't essential, because we often think about things as being essential. And that means that we end up working, oh, there's a police car outside. That means we tend to think that more things are essential than actually are. And that results in us working too late. When we should be doing other things, when we should be resting, when we should be spending time with friends, when we should be spending time with family, with our loved ones, when we should be looking after ourselves, we're working on things which aren't essential often. But we think they're essential, but we have to challenge ourselves about what actually is essential. And it may well be that they're important, but that doesn't mean they're essential. So you might need to spend just a little less time on them. The third category is could. So could is a requirement which is a nice to have, something that's nice and will be achieved if time and resources permit. Bearing in mind that your priority really is to look after yourself and people around you. So if time and resources permit you to look after yourself and look after people around you and still meet this requirement, still do this thing, then do it. But if not, then don't. Or it might be something that you want to do. It might be something that you normally when you focus on to a really high level. But it may just be that you don't need to focus on it to such a high degree of excellence. It may well be that, because it's a nice to have, it may well be that you can just do it. May well be you don't have to do it at all. Or it may well be that you just can do it, take less time on it. And finally, won't have. So these are the things, and it's really worth thinking about these in advance on projects, in advance of the work that you do, and making it clear to agreeing this with stakeholders. You're only one person. You're only one person. So this is a requirement that you cannot achieve at this time. You might consider it for the future, but resources don't allow you to achieve it at this time. Now, I know that this is very much an ideal world, and I know sometimes you're asked to do things which really aren't significant in terms of achieving the required impact on the stakeholders. But maybe you can spend a little bit less time on these things. Maybe there's a way of actually not doing them, or maybe there's a way of actually spending less time. I mean, in terms of my ex-client, my client Robert from this organization I was working with in Germany, he saw that actually, sending me really, really long emails was really a nice to have. It was a nice to have, but it's not essential. And he wanted to look after himself, so he didn't have the time to do that. So he sent me emails which didn't take him any time at all to write. And the only risk was that I might get a negative perception of him. But given the fact that we spoke on a regular basis, he thought he could mitigate that. So he saw it as being the right sort of balance there, because he wanted to make sure he looked after himself. And this is what we've got to do. We've got to think about what actually can we do that within the time that we got to do it in, bearing in mind that we don't want our work to seep into the space that we've got to look after ourselves and to look after the people around us. And that by space, I mean both the mental space and the practical space, the mental space and the actual space. So I know this is really challenging, but what I want you to do now is to have a think. I'm just going to give you a few minutes here just to reflect by yourselves. Have a think about something, about a project that you're working on, or it may be the day-to-day work that you've got on at the moment, and just have a think. Draw yourself a little table with these headings: must have, should have, could have, won't have. And just write down what things are a requirement which must be satisfied for your work to have the required impact, what things should be achieved if time and resources are available, what things are nice to have and achieved if time and resources permit, and what things you won't be able to achieve, but you might well consider it in the future. Just give yourself a time to reflect on this. What I'm challenging you to do is to think to yourself, this thing that I think is absolutely essential for me to do brilliantly, maybe I don't need to do it, don't need to spend quite so much time on it, and maybe I don't even need to do it at all. Maybe I can do it very, very quickly, or maybe I don't need to do it at all. So I'm just going to give you a bit of time just to reflect on this. This is an exercise that we encourage people to repeat and to do on a regular basis. Any questions about this as you do it, please put it into the chat box. I can see some chat coming up here. So I'm just reading some of the comments here. I like that analogy. This is the cake. It could be called the cake approach. You have to have cake. Icing would be good, but not essential. Cherry on top is nice to have. Hey, Sarah, whereas that's a good analogy, I'm not so sure it's a great analogy. You know who you're talking to here, don't you? You're talking to the person who only actually eats carrots and drinks water. And you're talking to the person who's one of the most annoying people that you've ever spoken to in your life when it comes to diet. But yeah, I see the point. I see the point. You'd be better off not having the cake at all. And Vanessa saying, I wonder if it'd be useful to scope work and project with these categories in mind. Yeah, you know, I've actually worked with organizations that actually build that into project scoping. In fact, I've helped organizations build this into project scoping. And I never used to do it. And it was around 2014 when somebody introduced me to this, a client that I was working with, and they built it into their project scoping. And they encouraged me to do it. And I actually had everything down as being a must. And the result was that I worked, I don't know, who knows, 60, 70 hours a week. My colleague who introduced this to me said to me one day, the difference between me and you is that I'm going to wake up on a Saturday morning and knowing that I'm going to have a nice day, whereas you're going to be waking up on a Saturday morning knowing that you're going to be doing some extra work. And she was absolutely right. Another comment, is it important to do this alongside resource and staff mapping? Yeah, it is. It's really important. It's still useful to do on an individual level, because on an individual level, you see, we sometimes give ourselves extra things which aren't really required by the stakeholders because we're perfectionists and we want to do everything brilliantly. So yeah, it is important to do this alongside, you know, organizational wide resource and mapping. It is also important to do this for ourselves, because sometimes, as I say, we give ourselves things to do. Sometimes we ask too much of ourselves. We just ask much too much of ourselves because we want everything to be perfect, and perfectionism doesn't exist. And that's because we're passionate, and we ask ourselves to do things that we just simply don't have the time to do, don't have the resources to do, either the mental resources or the actual resources to do. And it ends up eating into our lives, either because it takes time or because we worry about it, or we don't do it, and it gives ourselves something to you know, we give ourselves something to hit ourselves with. So yeah, just keep reflecting on this just for a few more minutes. as you're reflecting, is another comment that I wanted to make, and that is this, that often when we give work to people, almost always, particularly I think people that work in sectors like the heritage sector, what we have a tendency to do is to work really, really hard on reports, documents, projects, and we achieve it at a standard which actually makes us feel good, but isn't necessary for the people that we're delivering it to. And yeah, I mean, the argument is, well, we've got to do things that make us feel good. But at the same time, we've got to look after ourselves. This is the balance that we're always trying to reach, trying to achieve. So I've written documents, resource material for organizations, and found that really the amount of effort and time that I put into it really wasn't necessary at all. In actual fact, it works the other way around as well, because you think that, you know, people are going to notice mistakes that you make. Most of the time, nobody does. So I remember, I'm not suggesting you do this, but I remember when I was trying to overcome some of my perfectionism challenges, I was advised, I mean, this was actually by a counselor actually, who was saying, why don't you see what happens if you deliberately make some errors? If you deliberately don't correct some errors in some work that you were doing. She wasn't asking me to make deliberate errors. She was simply asking me to not spend time correcting them. And what was bizarre is that I did that and nobody ever mentioned anything at any stage. It was never even noticed. So what we perceive as being absolutely necessary, our perception of perfectionism is in other people's expectations. Our standards are often much, much higher. We've just got to think to ourselves, bearing that in mind, what can we spend slightly less time on? Or what potentially can we not do at all? So yeah, just going to give you another minute just to reflect on this. Okay. And along with this though, I mean, this is a really, really nice tool to use. It's a nice tool to use in project scoping, and it's a nice tool to use in relation to your day-to-day work. It's one of these tools that you can repeat on a regular basis, so that you can keep adjusting your approach to things.